Here's the breaking news. Senator Bill Nelson has now officially filed a new federal lawsuit to try to extend the recount that's going on, the pitched battle in this state of Florida, past the Thursday deadline that you see in state law. Now, there's no response yet from his opponent in the Senate race, Rick Scott. If there is, we will be bringing that to you live this hour tonight. We are here on the scene where workers have been recounting some of the more than 8 million votes cast in Florida. We are here at the Miami-Dade Elections Department. This is where another batch of important recounts have been occurring all day. We've been inside reporting. And now I want to take a moment and speak with Juan Cuba, chair of the local Democratic Party. Thanks for talking to me.
Thanks for having me.
What do you want to see come out of this recount?
I just want to make sure that every single vote is counted. We had millions of people come out to vote, and we should make sure that every single one of them is counted.
That was the push today in front of the elections board there, and Juan is here live now to talk more about this process in a moment. I also want to show you, though, more of our new reporting, because we went inside the building you just saw in the elections department. You can see here, this is the actual room today where workers are counting the ballots that were flagged. So you can see the workers in action. What we're looking at right now is the seals being broken on these boxes of preserved ballots and the recounting underway. We heard an elections official giving that briefing, and they're using these machines to do this recount mechanically of many of the early vote ballots. This is the same room we saw earlier that was waiting for this to start. The process goes forward, and if there is a manual recount, it is those over and under ballots that will ultimately be recounted by hand if that's triggered at the end of the manual recount. The impact of those ballots expected to reverberate in Washington, and it's back in D.C., where we're also seeing the most diverse, most female freshman class in the history of the House. Some of the pictures here of them arriving for orientation. New members include the first female Muslim American member of Congress, the first Native American woman in Congress, and, as you may have heard, the youngest woman ever elected to Congress, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She made a big splash attending a protest right outside Nancy Pelosi's office. So there in D.C., there, as the new numbers show the magnitude of the historic blue wave. Democratic House candidates, well, the counting continues, and here's the result. 7.3 million more votes total now than Republicans nationwide. That's the national vote margin of about 7 points, and that continues even as some of these key results, including Florida, are not fully resolved. Now, the Democrat running for governor here, Andrew Gillum, is holding an event at this very hour as the midterm continues to unfold in dramatic fashion.
A week after Election Day, Florida's 67 counties are racing to complete a recount of more than 8 million votes.
Lawyers for both sides are fighting it out in court.
A federal judge in Georgia last night may potentially open the door to an unknown number of ballots, probably somewhere in the thousands, provisional ballots being considered.
President Trump wanted Jeff Flake out of office in Arizona.
He is.
Well, now he's got a Democrat there instead.
Kyrsten Sinema becomes the first woman ever to serve as senator in Arizona, so it's a very big deal.
It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But we can work together to meet the challenges our country faces.
Let's get right to it live with my panel. I've got Juan Cuba here. He's chair of the Miami-Dade Democratic Party and was out in front of that building, as I mentioned. Former U.S. Attorney Kendall Coffey, an experienced federal prosecutor who's worked on these type of Florida cases, and a former Florida Congressman, Patrick Murphy. He's on the transition team for Nikki Fried, whose race for agricultural commissioner is the third recount going on in this state. He also tweeted this week that his absentee ballot was not counted because of an invalid signature match. I want to get to that because it shows this can happen to anyone, including people who've won elections, then not having your vote counted when you try to vote in an election. But Kendall, the big news here is Bill Nelson, the Democrat who's trying to hold on here and get back some votes, looking for more time. Does it mean something that he's filing this suit right now? And does he have any chance of winning in federal court?
Well, he's got a very good chance of winning. It's a basic principle that you can't have different standards for manual recount of votes in one Florida county in another. So simply stated, you can't have voters in Bay County, happens to be Republican, getting their votes recounted because of the markings they made, maybe not filling out the oval, but writing the word yes, making other markings that are designated by Florida law as establishing voters' intent, and then deny that to voters in Palm Beach County because their system isn't getting it done by the deadlines. And by the way, The premise, the principle that you can't have different standards in different Florida counties was established by the Supreme Court 18 years ago when they shut down the recount in Florida, saying that it was unconstitutional to have different standards in different counties.
Bill Nelson making waves here because up to this point in that race, it had been only the Republican governor who'd been filing cases. Congressman, I want to play a little bit of Senator Nelson. This is today, him talking about Rick Scott, his opponent. Take a look.
Mr. Scott cannot oversee the process in a fair and impartial way, and he should remove himself from the recount process.
Congressman, where do you see this going, given your experience in this state?
Well, it's always fun to watch Florida politics, and especially these recounts, and leave it to Florida to have these problems. To the senator's point, though, it's the fox watching the henhouse. You know, we saw the same situation unfolding in Georgia recently. If the roles were reversed and it was a Democrat in the same situation, I think we'd be having the same argument here. Democrats shouldn't be overseeing their own election count, right? This goes for both sides, and it's just for transparency and faith in our electoral process.
Why was your vote not counted, and what does that tell you about Florida?
It's hard to believe. I mean, I was quite frankly shocked when I, logged online to the Palm Beach County Supervisor of Election, website and said invalid signature. I go to click the button to, appeal it basically, and it said, oh no, you would have had to turn that paperwork in Monday the 5th, which is the day before the election. So not only did my vote not count, but there's nothing I can do about it. Come to find out, there are tens of thousands of people in this situation. And what's even worse is we have volunteers, and bless them for the work they do. But these aren't like forensic experts. These aren't signature experts doing this. And the fact that we're having this conversation in 2018 in the era of blockchain and biometric technology that's out there, and we're talking about volunteers looking at signatures, and an election in Florida coming down to 0.2%, 0.1%. We can do better than that.
And Brenda Snipes in Broward County, where we were last night, which was a whole different scene. I mean, we're in Miami-Dade tonight, and it was much more orderly. There's fewer people outside. It's just different. But Ms. Snipes has been targeted by Republicans. She made some news here deciding that she is going to, she says, after this recount, step back and resign from that post. Take a look.
It is time to move on, to let someone else, maybe be one of you guys out there, you're steeped in election business. I think I have served the purpose that I came here for, which was to provide a credible election product for our voters.
Congressman, when it comes to Florida having all of these issues, is it about the people in office mostly in your view, or is it just the way that elections work here and the rules?
Well, it's a combination. There's no doubt about it. And we can do better. Some of this does start with the lack of funding for these offices. We have a tremendous amount of growth in Florida. Something like 1,000 people a day are moving to Florida. We need to make sure we are continuing to fund these agencies so they have the staff. We have to make sure that they have the correct data, they have the correct ballot boxes and the technology necessary to handle this sort of growth, but also the management. In many cases, it appears that we could do better. And it's not just here in South Florida, right? Let's not forget about Bay County, right up in the Panhandle. It's certainly not the victims of the storm fault, but Rick Scott specifically said, do not allow people to vote by email. Lo and behold, the supervisor election there allowed people to vote by email. So we need to make sure that these supervisors of elections are following the letter of the law, and I believe we should have a consistent letter of the law there.
Juan, you look at Florida as a place where there was a lot of turnout, and this is something we're seeing across the board. Some of the stories of election night don't really become clear until later, and so the turnout for a midterm election was 49%. You have to go back to 1914 to find that high of a turnout, which was literally before women's suffrage, before women were allowed to vote in this country. As someone who's been a part of driving turnout for your party here as a Democrat in Florida, that's gotta be heartening. What do you think is the reason it was so high? Is it only a reaction to Trump, and will it continue?
We had historic turnout here in Miami-Dade. I think part of it was Mayor Gillum. He was a candidate that not just ran a traditional political campaign, but he really inspired a movement, inspired millions of people to get engaged. And I think that was a big part of it. I think one thing to point out, Ari, is that the State Department of Elections had election observers in the Broward County Supervisor Elections Office and saw no fraud. So this whole thing of trying to create conspiracy theories about Broward County is just another attempt by Rick Scott, Marco Rubio, and Donald Trump to undermine the ultimate results of this election once every vote is counted. And I think it's because they're nervous what it might say.
Well, that's what's so interesting that Scott did, and some of our guests argue this. He did appear to want to get the counting to stop, to freeze up the voting machines, although now, again, we have the Democrat Nelson trying to sue tonight. So, it's hard to tell which person is more nervous. It is razor thin. We were in there for this reason to do the reporting. We didn't see any voter fraud, and none of the election officials that we spoke to had that as a concern based on what they're seeing. Panel stays with me here as part of our live Florida coverage. I want to hit another part of the recount process that we also got to see up close today. Election workers were holding up these ballots for inspection. This is the process. You see the woman in the middle there, and they're holding up these ballots side by side as the monitors, who are representing both parties, are able to examine them. This was in the realm of duplicate ballots where it was not able to be read by the machine, and so you would duplicate the ballot and make sure both sides could sign off on that, and that was the room we were inside today. In our coverage, I want to bring in Elizabeth Coe, a staff writer for the Miami Herald in Tallahassee. As we try to get our arms around all of this, how is the recount going there and across the state? And your view, if you have one, on what it means that Nelson is asking for more time.
Well, thanks for having me. Obviously, the recount process is underway. I think at least 25 counties now have completed their recounts for the second unofficial returns, which are due Thursday at 3 p.m. Obviously, there are some counties like Broward and Palm Beach that are having more issues, as you and your team are probably aware. And that's something that remains to be seen if they'll meet those deadlines. The Palm Beach County Supervisor of Elections has expressed some concern that she won't meet the Thursday deadline. But, of course, official returns from those counties are due Saturday.
And what happens, do you think, if we get into the hand manual recount of those over and under votes?
I mean, I think that's going to be an incredibly difficult process for some of these counties. Like you mentioned earlier at the top of this segment, Senator Bill Nelson has sued today in Tallahassee to try and delay that Saturday deadline for which the hand recounts, should they be ordered, which is likely in 2 of these statewide races. He's sued to try and delay that deadline so that they have more time to finish them.
And how, in your reporting, do you think Florida, from the grassroots level of citizens up to officials, how does Florida feel about being back in the middle of one of these? I mean, it's literally a triple recount.
I think everybody's feeling particularly tense. I doubt people are feeling more tense than Governor Scott and Senator Bill Nelson, as judging by these lawsuits that each of them have filed. The situation here in Tallahassee, at least, is nervous in some of these cases, but it's pretty clear that in at least one race for governor, some things here in state government are still continuing to move on a different track. Ron DeSantis, who is currently the presumed governor-elect, given the status of that recount, has been trying to pull together a transition team, but it's pretty obvious, at least in the Senate race, that both sides are still really fighting to see who is the winner in that count.
And Congressman, widening out to the panel here while I have you, just more broadly, we've been talking to a lot of people, not only about the turnout, but why it broke so decisively for Democrats in the House races. Health care is the main thing I've heard. You've served in Congress. Is that your view?
Yes, Republicans are trying to paint this image of Democrats as talking about impeachment and just obstructing. That's exactly the opposite of what Democrats are trying to do. They are trying to extend an olive branch and talk about how do we solve health care, right? How do we get the Affordable Care Act right? How do we make sure we protect those with pre-existing conditions compared to the Republicans that are trying to repeal it? How do we pass meaningful infrastructure reform? How do we pass meaningful, reform with taxes for the middle class, not just the top 1%? So they really want to get things done. That is going to be their message. And voters saw that overwhelmingly. We saw a 7% increase there with the votes, or 7%, margin of victory across the board. That is a huge win. If it wasn't for the gerrymandering and Citizens United, the extreme amount of money that Republicans have, Democrats would have the majority would have had it and will continue to have it for years to come.
And you're not in Congress anymore, but you still sound like a congressman. You look like a congressman.
Don't ask the question. I'm not going back.
You're not going back?
No, hey, never say
never. You're wearing
never.
a flag pin, which anyone can wear for any great reason, but it feels to me like you might run again.
Well, look, I enjoyed my time. There's no doubt about it. I was humbled to serve, the state of Florida.
You're doing it right now.
Exactly.
You're doing it right now.
Finding
You're
other
humbled.
ways to serve. I ran for the Senate unsuccessfully, and I'd love to have an opportunity to run again. But right now, with the divisions we see and the gridlock and the hatred, it's really tough to think about.
Well, there is that, and I think we hear that with the mixed signals we've gotten. On the one hand, a whole wave of new candidates who are excited to get involved. On the other hand, we don't have to repeat it, a dark time in politics that has some people saying, why put yourself or your family through that? Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.